Now, I am very excited. We have one last keynote speaker before we kind of come towards drawing the threads together, and a little bit of music from Mexico to kind of see us out. But Dr. Harvey Kwiyani is here. He's from Malawi. He works for the Church Mission Society, and he runs a center looking at global migration and mission. And we're so delighted he came. His train was cancelled at like 6 o'clock in the morning and still managed to make it here, so we're grateful. What would you like by way of microphone? Would you like can you use a handheld? Is that okay? Brilliant. Okay, I'll clear this for you so you've got a bit of space. And can I ask you to give a warm welcome to Harvey?
Thank you. We're getting towards the end of the day, so I will try and be as quick as possible. I'm not using PowerPoint, I'm just telling stories. I hope that they will communicate. I come from Malawi. I live in Liverpool. I taught at a university, I will not mention the name, and I taught an introduction to theology class for first-year students. So they're just coming in. This is their first class in uni. Many of them were training to become teachers in religious education. So I meet them, first lecture in uni, first week. And I was teaching them introduction to African Christianity and African religion. Now, I taught the course for 5 years, so I did this for a good 5 years. In the first lecture, when I met them the first time, it would be a group of around 35, 40, 50 students, varied. Most of them white British. I could get probably an occasional Asian, but it was probably all white most of the time. When they came in, first lecture, I asked them, how many of you are religious? And consistently, it was always 10%. White British, 18, 19, 20-year-olds. 10%. For the whole 5 years, 10% would say, oh, I'm religious. And then I would ask them, what religion? Right? And it would be half of the 10% that would be Christian, and the other half would be following some other religion. Right? So out of 50, you're getting 2 or 3 Christians, and this was consistent, a good 5 years. And then I would ask them, do you know any Christians? Right? And at this point in time, everybody in class has something to offer. And they would consistently talk about the Nigerians and the Ghanaians and the Koreans and the Brazilians that rented our school buildings for their church services. And some of them would go a step further and say, I am not a Christian. I don't know any Christian. There's no Christian in my family, not in my generation, not in my parents' generation, not in my grandparents' generation. 1 or 2 people would go ahead and say, I'm a 4th generation pagan. White British kids. But what struck me consistently through this period was when they thought of Christians, they thought of migrants. In their minds, they believed that Christianity is a black and brown person's religion, not a white person's religion. And this was consistent. Now, of course, if you had said this to the missionaries back in 1910, that a time is coming when it will be the struggle for the church, for migrant Christian communities, it will be to raise their children in the faith in Britain, right? That it's easier to raise up your children in the faith in Malawi and other parts of the world, not in Britain, because everybody around them is secular. So that's one. 2, we're in London. We know that Peter Brealey, a church research statistician who has worked on the church census for a long time, back in 2011 published a book that was a research report. And the title of the book was London Churches Are Growing, right? He was reflecting on trends that he had seen starting around 2004, 2005, that against all reason, at a time when churches are shrinking around the country, it began to look like, actually in London, something happening, something different, something strange is happening. So, of course, in 2006, he published a book called Pulling Out of the Nosedive. And in that book, he's reflecting on the fact that it looked to him at the time that the church, Christian communities, at least in London, are pulling out of the nosedive. We are no longer shrinking. We're beginning to add numbers of Christians. So, of course, he followed up that research with the research that he published in 2011. London churches are growing again. When you look at the data, the data is from 2009, 2010. It is clear that it is the African church that is growing in London, and it's growing fast enough to offset the continued exodus that was happening in other churches. So the data, it's clear. 50% of church attendance from that report, 50% of church attendance in London on any given Sunday was black. Africans, Afro-Caribbeans, consistently. I had a chat with Peter Brealey 2 years ago. I went to him with this question: how is it looking now? And he says, actually, anecdotally, we can say it's 60 or 65% of church attendance in London on any given Sunday is going to be black. Black people form only 14% of London's population, 1/4. So you have 14% of the city's population accounting for 60% of church attendance. Migration. I just came back from Germany and we were wrestling with these issues, and somebody told me that parts of Amsterdam, you actually find that 90% of church attendance is black in Europe. Right? Now, what that means is that European Christianity, whether we want it or not, whether we agree or not, but European Christianity is beginning to get a black identity because of migration. That European Christianity is becoming black because of migration. I do think that actually a great deal of what happens on the Christian landscape in London and in many European cities today is shaped by things going on in Africa. That something happens in Africa, a prophet speaks in Accra or in Lagos or in Nairobi. 2 weeks later, whatever he said in those places is here in London, in Manchester, in Birmingham. Migration. Now, I don't think that this should surprise us. Really, because this whole story, right from the beginning, is a story of migration. The Christian story is shaped to a great extent by migration. I think it was Ruth Padilla who talked about Jesus going to Egypt. Before he was born in Bethlehem, grew up in Nazareth. But before he got to Nazareth, where he would grow up, he had to experience the diaspora life. He had to be an immigrant. Of course, at the time, there were more Jews in Alexandria than there were in Jerusalem. This whole thing, the Acts 2, Pentecost, that story really makes sense when we begin to realize that it was a meeting of the Galileans and the diaspora. And once the diaspora pick up the story, it changes. It becomes something else. And so, by the time we get to Acts 11, something happens in Antioch. It's a diaspora Jew who is sent to go and see what's happening in Antioch. And he goes to pick up another diaspora Jew from Tarsus. And the story is different. The rest is history. What makes these people in Antioch find a new way to call this community Christians is because Antioch was a migration hub. It was the London of the time. If you are in the Roman Empire, you want to travel from Asia to Rome, you pass through Antioch. You're coming from Africa by land, you want to get to Constantinople, you pass through Antioch. That was the hub. And it is because of this community of people who had come from different parts of the world, worshiping together, that somebody says, let's get them a name. Christians. Now, we can go back through church history, read it as mission history, and we'll realize that actually it's migration, Christian migration, that shapes a great deal of church growth, the expansion of the church around the world, more than the actual sending of missionaries. This era of European mission agencies, American mission agencies, is just a small window. Christian migrants have been taking the faith with them and expanding the church for the past 2,000 years. And I do think that at this point in time, we've seen the statistics. At this point in time, we have a crucial window in which we can actually make sense of this in a world that actually needs our hospitality and needs us to think through what does it mean to be an immigrant. So, Christian migrants are the people in many cities around Europe, some cities in the United States, they are the people who are holding up the faith. Back in the 1800s, somebody talked about the hope that in the future, Christians will come from the unevangelized lands at the time to invigorate British Christianity. I submit to you that's happening now, and it's through migration. Thank you so much. Let me stop here.